everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Energy If You Know, You Know podcast. Season 2 is sponsored by Liberty Energy. We're thrilled to support this podcast and bring you conversations with both Gen Z professionals and C-suite executives, fostering a mutual exchange of career advice and industry insights. I'm your host, Audrey Flynn, and joining me today is Dan Haley, president of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. Dan, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, when we talked before, you said you had a very diverse work background. You started out as a journalist to your now current role as president of COGA. Can you tell listeners a little more about your early professional career and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I had not a very direct line into oil and gas. I wanted to be a sports writer initially when I first got into journalism. When I got into college, I was covering sports. I went to the University of Wyoming and I covered University of Wyoming football and basketball for the student newspaper. And I was also freelancing for the Denver Post at the time. And so I thought I wanted to be a sports writer. But knowing that those jobs were kind of difficult, I started writing news, features, just really expanding my portfolio. And I got into news writing, and I started doing that directly out of college. I worked up in Gillette, Wyoming, which is coal country. There's some oil and gas up there now, but started working up there as a reporter, and then eventually worked my way into being an editor and found my way back to the Denver Post. I grew up in Denver, so I very much wanted to be back in this state, wanted to raise my family here, wanted to start a family and raise a family here. And I got a job at the Denver Post as a suburban editor and thought that I would do that for, the rest of my life and be a journalist and just, work at a newspaper. And things changed rapidly in that time that I was at the Denver Post to where I really had a hard time seeing what the future looked like in that particular field with the internet coming on and just changes, technological changes that were happening in that industry. So I very much had to figure out how I was going to make a living going forward and not be in newspapers. And so, long story, I eventually found my way into oil and gas. What I did was I sat there in my early 40s at the time, working at the Denver Post. I was the editorial page editor of the newspaper. So that meant you're in charge of the opinion of the newspaper. You're the voice of the newspaper. You run columns from other people who are writing letters to the editor, all the things that are related to opinion. And I thought, how do I take this interest in policy, this interest in politics, almost more than an interest, a passion in policy and in politics and communications, and turn that into a career outside of newspapers. And so I worked in corporate communications for a little while, and then I started consulting and trying to figure out how I can help industries or businesses maneuver this intersection of politics, policy, and communications. And that ultimately, the long story, led me to COGA, where I've been now for the past 9 years.
Very cool. Yeah, I think that's an inspiring story, especially for so many young professionals just finding their way in the industry and seeing how much these new communication platforms are really evolving, and there's so many new jobs in that field now.
It's everything is changing, right? And so when I grew up in a world where your parents got jobs and worked for 50 years at the same place, and they would get a gold watch upon retirement, and you had a pension and you stayed places. And then people started hopping around when when 401ks came around and you could take your retirement with you. And so people started moving jobs. And so I kind of got ahead of the game in terms of this idea of like determining what your skills are and figuring out how those are applicable elsewhere and who might want to utilize your skills. And I think for young people, that's going to be the road going forward, is understanding that you might have many careers, you might have many different jobs at many different companies. So what are your skills? How are they applicable? And how can you sell them to somebody who wants to pay you for them?
Absolutely, yeah. And I was just having this conversation the other day with someone. I was saying I wasn't expecting to get into oil and gas in college. I was a marketing major, and I didn't really know what the future meant for me. And so I didn't really have that in my foresight. But bringing the skills that I learned throughout college and my different internships and kind of seeing how I can help in the oil and gas industry has been super cool. Definitely a learning curve, but something that I've been really excited about. So kind of a segue into that is, for those who may not be familiar with COGA, can you tell us a little more about what you do here?
Sure. So the Colorado Oil and Gas Association is a statewide trade association. We represent companies that work in oil and gas, those upstream companies that pull the product out of the ground, the midstream companies that take it downstream, the downstream companies who refine it and turn it into different products, fuel for our cars, for jets, and anybody in between who works in this industry who cares about oil and gas development in Colorado can be a member of COGA, and then we advocate for those members at the legislature, in front of our regulatory bodies. We talk to the media. We work on public relations, communications, really anything we can do to support this vital industry in Colorado.
Awesome. That's great. And I think that's interesting for a lot of people too who are in Gen Z and wanting to get involved. They can go onto your guys' website, correct, and sign up through there?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a program called Energy IYKYK, which is designed to let people who support this industry, who work in industry, understand more about what's at stake when it comes to the politics in Colorado, what's happening at the legislature, what's happening at our regulatory bodies, and how can you have a voice in that. So we provide information and we'll say, this bill has been introduced to the legislature. Here's what it does. Here's how you can have a voice in that process. Reach out to your lawmaker. Call them, go to their town hall meetings, send them an email, talk to them on social media, whatever the case may be. You have a stake in what's happening in our state, and you have a voice in that. And if your voice isn't being exercised, then our lawmakers are not hearing you. And so that Energy Advocates program is designed just for that, and to get people really engaged in what we're doing.
That's great. And then I guess, so kind of another segue into that, what projects or initiatives are you working on currently at COGA that are most exciting to you?
Yeah, so we have a lot of rulemakings happening right now at the state. In 2019, the legislature passed something called Senate Bill 181, which was designed at that time to be the most comprehensive oil and gas regulation overhaul in 60 years. And that set into motion a series of rulemakings that we're still dealing with today and working and engaging with the state on these different rules. And so every aspect of our industry has been under this regulatory microscope as they work to find ways to make those laws more protective of the environment, of the health of people, and of wildlife. And so we're at the table for those rulemakings to ensure that we are being protective of the environment, right? That we're being protective of people, of our neighbors, of wildlife, but we're still able to operate. And so that's one of the things we try to bring to the table is the real life implications of these rules. It may sound great at the state capitol for somebody to say, this is what we think the oil and gas industry ought to do. We then come to the table and say, sounds good, but if you do that, here's the implication. Here's what's going to happen. What if we did this? And we provide a different opportunity, right? To ensure we're being protective of the environment, but also to ensure we can continue to produce this resource in Colorado under these very protective standards. We have among the toughest environmental rules in the world here in Colorado. And so it's important for us to produce this resource here, cleaner, better, and safer than most anywhere in the world. If we're not, we're going to rely on energy from other states or other countries, which is not a good environmental solution. So we're advocating essentially for oil and gas and for the environment.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that's great for a lot of listeners too. They're always worried, even if they are pro oil and gas, they're worried about the implications that it's going to make to the environment. So coming to COGA is definitely a good way to get involved and make progress in that while also protecting the environment and doing it in the most safe way.
Yeah. And really learning, you know, how to talk about the climate and climate change. And we have a statement that we produced several years ago on climate change, because I thought it was important because people in oil and gas don't really know how to talk about it. And sometimes people are afraid to talk about it because you're going to get blamed for climate change. I think we need to talk about it, and we need to understand how to talk about it and talk about how we're part of the solution through using more natural gas versus coal, and bringing down that emissions profile, bringing down the amount of carbon that goes into the air. We have a great story to tell when it comes to climate change, but we're afraid to tell it because other people are telling it for us and putting us in the corner and making us, you know, reactive to what they're saying. We need to be out in front, especially with young people. When you're talking about climate change, you've grown up with that word. You've grown up with this notion that carbon and different things being emitted into the atmosphere are changing the climate and changing how we live our lives. And some people will say, you know, will create very catastrophic risks from that. And so if we're not talking about it, then it's, you know, that narrative's being set for us.
Absolutely. And I think being Gen Z myself, I struggle being in the oil and gas industry and also being able to talk about those things. So, just for everyone else who's listening, what are some talking points that you would give to people like myself who are in the oil and gas industry and want to be able to go into a conversation confidently talking about climate change?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is I would start, and we try to start conversations by talking about our shared values, right? Let's talk about what we agree on. We all agree that clean air is essential. We all agree that clean water is essential. We all agree that we want to protect the surface and the land and use less of it for energy development if we can. And so let's start there and then work our way through all the issues that are out there. I would say, so start there. We share the same values that you share. So then let's talk about what energy makes sense for us. We need more energy as a world, not less. Think about all the things that you do every single day that require energy that maybe didn't exist 15, 20 years ago. The things that you have plugged in at night, your phone, your laptop, your iPad, your television, everything is requiring vast amounts of electricity. And so we need energy. And we're adding more people to the world. The population is growing. So what kind of energy makes sense, right? And then begin having those, can we support the grid through renewables alone today? No. Can we support the grid through renewables alone 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Very unlikely with the, there's some, huge change in technology. And we should lean into all those things too, that technology, right? So we know we need energy. We know that oil and natural gas are going to be a huge part of that going forward. So the question becomes, how do we then produce that resource cleaner, better, and safer? And if we're not doing it here, where are we going to get that energy from? That's the other question. Are you going to get it from Russia, a country that invades other countries to establish energy dominance through military dominance? Are we going to get it from a country like Venezuela, which is melting down right now? We've already put sanctions on the country. Or we're going to get it from a country like Iran, that produces oil and then uses the proceeds from that to kill Americans overseas? These are the questions that we have to deal with, right? And I think young people especially have to deal with this. We're talking about your future. We're talking about your future. Do you want to have a grid that supports the modern lifestyle? If you do, then you want to make sure we have natural gas that's going to support that grid, and we're producing it in this country.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that's great advice for people kind of just moving forward, just to start with talking points. I love what you said about finding common ground with that.
And we share that love of the environment. It really bothers me that we've come to the situation where if you're anti-oil and gas, you're an environmentalist. So then what are you if you're pro-oil and gas? I believe we're environmentalists too. We have a lot of people in this industry who are out, they recreate in the wild. They fish, and they want to fish in clean waters, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to think that if you're working in this industry, you're supporting this industry, that you don't care about the environment. But we've ceded ground on that argument, and we've let them be the environmentalists, and we need to take that ground back and be the environmentalists as well.
Yes, definitely. So then I guess kind of another follow-up question to this is, how do you think Gen Zs and C-suite leaders like yourself can work together to kind of bridge this communication gap that we're having about climate and oil and gas, and kind of seeing like the good that we can do while still protecting the environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's always gaps in generations over time. And it's really about having conversations, finding that common ground, being around each other, listening to each other, not just talking. And it's important for younger generations to hear the wisdom of older generations. And it's important for older generations to understand that you can do things differently. You don't have to keep doing the same things over and over again. And so I know when you're the younger generation, you feel like no one is listening to you, and you feel like you're being typecast and characterized as something that you're not. Know that we felt the same way. I'm a member of Generation X, and when we came into the workforce, we were considered slackers. I remember my very first job, there was a guy there that would always call me, he's like, "You're a whiner, you're Gen X, you're a whiner." And I'm like, "I'm not a whiner." And he's like, "You're whining right now." And I was like, "Well, you're calling me names." So of course I'm kind of whining. But, so he was already had a view of who we were as a generation. And so it's important for older generations to remember that, and that, the next generation coming up isn't always bad, and that they've got a lot to offer if you listen to them and hear what they have to say, especially when it comes to things like communication and finding new ways to talk to each other, and understand that everybody's not doing it the same way that we used to.
Yes, yeah. And so I'm the social media coordinator at Liberty. And so my role was created when I first started, so about a year and a half ago. And I think a lot of people were at first hesitant. They're like, oh, is she going to just make funny videos? But a lot of our communication nowadays has to be up in the forefront, and we have to be staying on top of these issues, or else it's very easy to fall irrelevant now, especially when people are posting 5 or 6 times a day. So I guess another thing is, what is COGA doing on social media to kind of stay relevant and keep up with trends and get your guys' messaging out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I learned early on when I was in newspapers and doing communication, the importance of social media as a tool. I didn't know much about it when it came around, and people started saying like, hey, I posted your column on Facebook. I'm like, oh, what is that,
Cool.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I got an account and I looked and learned, and we started posting things online, and I saw the difference in audiences. So for example, the newspaper, you endorse a candidate, and typically you would do that in the newspaper on a Sunday morning, and people would look at it and go, oh, they endorse so-and-so. We started doing them on Friday afternoons, and then we would put it in the newspaper on Sunday, and you would see email traffic and different traffic from your analytics would spike on Friday, and then on Sunday you'd start getting emailed letters or written letters that would go in the mail, right? So you're like, oh, there's 2 totally different audiences out here. One of them is living online and consuming everything online. The other one is doing it through this very old-fashioned traditional method of a newspaper. How do you reach both of those audiences? You can't ignore one. And so when I came into COGA, we were doing things very traditionally. We would put out a press release. We would put out a statement. We would mail it to reporters. Okay, that's great. But how else do we get that information out? How do we get it onto Facebook? How do we get it onto Twitter or X or Instagram through reels and videos? And so we just started experimenting with all these different things to ensure that we were putting our information, our content out onto all these different platforms so people could consume it as they want to consume it, whether that's through a video, through a press release, through a very short tweet, through a podcast, through all these different things that we can do. And so it's easy to dismiss that and go, oh, you're just going to do funny videos. Well, there's something to that because a zillion people watch those funny videos every day. How many people read a press release? Not very many. So how do you tell that story in a funny video? How do you get our information out through unconventional people and resources? And we don't do a very good job of that. I don't think, and I don't mean COGA in general, I just mean industry in general, doesn't do a very good job of that and embracing the ability to do that. I see more and more of it. I think COGA was at the forefront of that and putting things out onto TikTok and to different places where people weren't expecting us to be, yet our employees are there. The people who are consuming that, my kids are on there looking at TikTok. So how do we get that information out there? We can all do a better job of it. And the great thing about it is it's so quick. Like you just put it out there, and if it doesn't work, you see that it didn't work, so you don't do it again. You try something else. And so it's cool. So you have to embrace, it's very much this kind of Wild West mentality, and you have to embrace it or you're going to get left behind.
Absolutely. And I can kind of speak to that. I think a lot of it is, it's awesome to have all the different platforms because it's brand recognition no matter how you see it. You see a video put out on TikTok by COGA, and then when you go to the LinkedIn or you see a press release, you're like, oh, I saw that funny video, and then you're more inclined to read that maybe 5 or 6 page something or another that you weren't going to read before. So I think that's super cool that a lot of oil and gas companies are now kind of pivoting to use all those different communication tools to kind of reach different audiences.
Absolutely. And you don't have to wait for somebody to tell your story for you. And that's what it was for the past 200 years, right? You would work with a reporter and hope that they see your angle on a story and try to get that placed in a newspaper or on a television, news program or something like that. Now you get to tell your own story. You get to go straight out to the audience that you want via whatever it is, podcast, video, short, reel or whatever else, and tell your story and define yourself for your audience. And that's really cool. And that's something that is fairly new in the last 10, 15 years. And you have to be thinking, how is that going to change again? And how can we be prepared for that next change and not get stuck doing just this, right? So what's going to come after this? I don't know. but we have to have our eyes open and be ready for it.
Yeah, and I can say it's always constantly evolving. So I'll have like a trend ready to go one week and it won't get filmed fast enough. So I'm like, well, we're discarding that, moving on to the next. So I think it's good to like stay on top of that and stay on top of the ball with that to keep your brand really relevant, especially when it comes to less conventional ways. I know like companies who are in advertising and marketing, they're very like, if you're drinking like a Coke, you see all those advertisements, but then you're starting now more to see like Colorado Oil and Gas Association ads on the TV or something like that. And so I think it's super cool that we're kind of stepping into that space more so as well.
But you still have to be authentic, right? And you have to be, we very much from a COGA standpoint want to be fact-based and be putting out good information that's accurate and credible. But you want to be authentic. And again, I'll stereotype generations. Your generation is, I don't want to say cynical, but you have access to a lot more information than any other generation in history has had. And so you see things and you're maybe skeptical is a better way to say than cynical, right? And you'll see through a corporate line when they're trying to sell you a soft drink or something, right? You're like, that's ridiculous. So you have to be authentic and you can't, you just got to be careful about how you're putting that information out there.
Yeah, definitely. And you can have fun with your messaging, but it does all come back to, brand guidelines and kind of sticking true to like the name of what your guys' messaging is. So I really think that's cool. So then I guess to end this segment before we go into a little fun segment, what is one message that you hope sticks out to the audience watching this podcast today?
Regarding energy or?
Regarding just everything that we've talked about. So one key takeaway that you would like to leave with our listeners today.
Well, that's a great thought. And I wish I was, some brilliant idea that I could put out there. So I will go back to what we talked about in this idea that the world needs energy and that we should be all in on figuring out how we can best produce that in ways that are affordable and efficient, that keep the lights and power on and protect the environment.
Absolutely.
And if that's oil and gas, if that's nuclear, if that's renewables, we should be exploring all of those things and doing what's best for humanity, because if we don't have energy, we're not going to be able to live the lives that we have grown accustomed to. And I want my kids and maybe someday grandkids to have.
Awesome.
And that's going to be your generation that's going to have to lead that.
Yes. So it is on us.
Yeah. Sorry we left you this huge mess, but good luck with everything.
We're going to figure it out. All right. So moving into kind of a more fun segment that I do.
The rest of it was all fun.
Yes, that was fun too. And this is Gen Z slang terms that we use.
Okay.
And so I'm going to give you a word and I want you to try to use it in a sentence. And then I'll let you know, or if you need a hint, let me know.
If I had the context right?
Yeah, if you were close or if you weren't. Okay, so the first one I'm going to say is ghost or ghosted.
Okay, I know that one. So I went to a party and I was going to meet somebody and he totally ghosted me.
Okay, yeah, that was absolutely perfect.
Nailed it.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Yes,
all right.
Thank you.
All right, 1 for 1. All right,
I'm down with the
second
kids.
one. Yeah, you are. So the next one I have for you is T.
T. Oh, I know that one too.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
I should have picked harder ones.
So let me find a good sentence to say. So Gabby comes to work and she's always spilling the tea about what other people are doing.
That's perfect as well, gossiping.
Yeah, and I'm just using, it's a fictional character, Gabby. It's not anybody that I know.
No one that you know or have ever crossed paths with. Okay, so the next one, maybe this will be harder, maybe this will be easy for you. NGL.
Oh. NGL. I know what you're talking about. I'm not going to lie.
Oh my goodness. All right, not going to lie. I should have probably picked some harder ones.
Throw a harder one at me. What else you got?
Okay, let's see. How about, have you ever heard bet?
Yes.
Do you know how to use it?
I think it's like an affirmative to say like bet. Like if
Did you study before
I have a 22-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old daughter.
Okay.
And I do listen to them occasionally.
Okay.
So I pick up some of these things.
So then this is another
And then I'm online.
Well, yeah.
And that's where I saw NGL was online.
And
I also Google these things. I don't always immediately know what they are.
Yeah. Well, good. You're 4 for 4 right now. All right. The last one that I had for you, and I know you know this one, but throwing shade.
Yeah, I know throwing shade. And did I share that on the
yes.
Yeah. I picked that up from a young colleague about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer. And I very much wanted to use it in conversation with my daughters when I got home. And so we were having dinner, and my daughter was talking about something that was happening at school. And I said, look, what's going on is that girl is tossing shadows. It's not appropriate. She goes, stop. What are you talking about? I said, tossing shadows, it's a thing. And she goes, it's throwing shade, and you should never say that again. And so I don't use that very often. I will use tossing shadows if I need to.
Well,
but
you heard it here first. That's the new Gen Z
so if
slang
everybody
term,
could start using tossing
shadows.
shadows, that would be fantastic.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today,
Absolutely.
Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
This is great. Good luck.